It was great seeing everyone last night in class. As promised, here is a brief presentation about Chapter 7 and 8 of Healthcare Information Systems, our textbook. So briefly, we're going to talk about what is the definition of system acquisition, the development life cycle for this process, and the acquisition process. We're going to talk about some specific project management tools and unfortunately things that could go wrong, and hopefully we will be mindful of these things in our future planning. So system acquisition, this is the process that refers from the time the decision is made that you're going to get a new system or replace an existing system until a contract has been negotiated or signed. So if you work for a outpatient provider practice and you have an antiquated electronic medical record that works more like a word processor than a fully integrated EHR, from the time that the people that make decisions in that practice make the decision to select a new system to replace the current one, until the contract is signed and the decision is made what vendor is going to be used, is all known as the system acquisition process. So the systems development life cycle takes into account that, no one would recommend, starting any sort of project without a comprehensive plan. So this life cycle that we're going to talk about is very helpful to have a systematic and organized way to develop and acquire your new system. These are the 4 phases that you can see here: planning and analysis, design, implementation, support, and evaluation. So we're going to go into a little bit about each of these phases of the life cycle. So during the first phase, planning and analysis, this is when the organization decides what current systems really are in need of improvement. You can take a critical look at what is currently being used and what are some of the needs of what they're gonna need in the future. The next phase is the design phase. That considers all the options. Is this something that we'll be able to maybe contact a rep or a vendor that we're currently working with, or is this going to be a really large scale project? And this is an important consideration, especially in this economy and with the way that outpatient, if we continue with this example, outpatient practices, many are aligned with a larger entity such as a healthcare system. So some of that design talk may happen with them. Implementation is after, so this is the first part of acquisition. This is the second part, is the implementation phase. This happens when the contract has actually been signed and, all of the decisions are made. But probably one of the most important processes following project implementation is support and evaluation. And when you guys listen to the other presentation that Calvin Norway and myself worked on for you, it is important to consider optimization. So it's great that a product, is up and running, but if it's not optimized to meet the needs of the end user, significant struggles can happen. There's a potential for error, and you really need to include this in your plans. So prior to your acquisition, the whole healthcare team that's involved in this process should really work together. And if this is, again, continue with that example of an outpatient practice, if everyone from the secretary to the medical assistant to the nurse advanced practice nurses, physicians, physician's assistants, anyone who at all might be in the office really should be part of this process. And goals and strategies of how the IT will be employed really should be articulated. What are people specifically looking for? And once you identify those priorities based on all of the members of your team, you really want to come up with priorities. Again, IT is very expensive, as we've talked about in earlier classes. So what would be the priorities for this organization? And then, of course, someone needs to pay for it, so budgetary approval and institutional support to happen. So we talked about establishing this steering committee of people who are going to help be part of this acquisition process. And they need to have the knowledge and skills necessary to identify, what are some of the big needs for the organization. It's wonderful. There's now if you work for a large health system, a role called as the chief medical informatics officer, or perhaps you have nursing informatics officers that work with you that really help bring light to these projects. Otherwise, if it's a smaller entity that's engaging in the system acquisition process, then you really need to appoint a point person and a project manager, someone who's going to, be ultimately responsible for coordinating this project. Your book talks about having, not having a group that's too large. Perhaps 5 to 6 people is ideal. But it's going to be next to impossible if you are the director of a service line, perhaps the operating room at a large tertiary care center. It's going to be really impossible to have a committee of only 5 people when you might have to include lab medicine, pharmacy, radiology, IT, administration, and a whole bunch of other people. But you really have to define your project and what is the scope. What do you hope to accomplish as a steering committee? So probably one of the most important things is why does the organization hope to accomplish by getting this proposed system? So why are we doing this? Everybody seems to like the bells and whistles of technology, but you really have to take a critical analysis of what your individual and organization's position is, to help define what are you looking for in a system. If it's e-prescribing, you want to make sure that feature is available. If it is, increased patient access of their, across service locations, then that's another consideration. And always, just like all goals, they must be specific and measurable. And you really have to make sure that they align with your mission statement. And again, you're not going to be able to get everything that you dream of, or maybe you will. Maybe you'll be in a position where you're leading a team and you can do those things, but priority is the key. So you and your team are going to have to develop a request for a proposal, an RFP. And it's going to be a list that vendors can work from that identifies the system requirements, the features, the functions, and some of the other special requests that you have. And that's important for you to articulate what the specific needs are for your project area. Some people also use a request for information, which is a less formal, considerable shorter than an RFP and less time consuming. And it just gives some basic facts. You're asking for background, product descriptions, and system capabilities. But chances are the way as complex as healthcare and financial decisions are, you guys will be working with RFPs. So the typical components of an RFP are the instructions for the vendor. What are they supposed to do? What are the objectives of the project for the organization? They'll give some background on the organization, especially helpful if we are seeking a vendor that's outside of our geographic region and we haven't worked with them before. We're going to articulate what our goals and requirements are of this project. We're going to ask them that, articulate what are some of the qualifications that we would like in a vendor. We may identify some of our own proposed solutions. We'll give a time frame for evaluating proposals and specific criteria relating to it. We have to articulate what our contractual requirements are, and that's going to be specific. That's something that you're going to have to work with your legal department on. And, you may include budget information in that piece of your RFP. So this is just an example. If you were going to evaluate a company that is offering a healthcare system, might be some of the things that are identified as a priority for your group, and then just coming up with, do they meet the requirements or not? Just keeping the information as streamlined as possible for yourself. So once you get your RFPs in, you're going to have to do a cost-benefit analysis, and you're going to have to identify, because you're going to have a lot of different proposals that you get from vendors. You're going to have to consider the benefits of each option, and usually as a group you complete a summary report and you make recommendations. And usually 2 to 3 vendors make your final running. And then you negotiate contracts. This is what sometimes ends up becoming a bidder. So this is an example from your book on page 230 of a usability instrument that is a questionnaire that if you have the opportunity for end users to respond, you definitely do not want to purchase anything without the people who are actually going to be using the product day-to-day evaluating. But you need to get quantitative data to support. So, you can't just focus on the subjective, I like this, I hate this. You really should gather data about specific elements as you are engaging in thoughts related to which vendor to go with, who's. So things can go wrong, and sometimes there's failure to manage vendor access to organizational leadership. So your book talks on page 235 about someone kind of going over your head and going to the CEO and thereby influencing their decision to select a product. They give some pretty funny examples if you're interested in looking at that in the book. And I don't know, maybe one of you guys one day will be taken to the Super Bowl to get bribed into buying a certain EHR. There might be failing to keep the process objective. So, you get caught up in the emotion, or you really like the vendor, but maybe the product isn't too fabulous. Maybe you have not done your due diligence with that RFP. Failure to involve the leadership team and users extensively during system selection. And this is the people who are the end users and those who supervise them need to be actively involved in this process. And finally, your book talks about the unfortunately the very tense relationships that can go on during the negotiation process. So in sum, it's important to have a systematic process in place when you're going about system acquisition. We went over some of the key tasks that generally occur. We talked about how important it is to critically look at the details of your project, and we talked about some of the things that could derail the acquisition process. So Chapter 8 talks about the system implementation and support, and viewed, or not rather, you will view it separately. I have posted separately a presentation between a close colleague of mine, Mr. Calvin Norway, who is a IT and medical technology and informations expert at Yale. And we will, in that video, talk about some of the operational and application challenges that you may face. So what's ahead? We're going to talk a little bit about the system implementation process, managing the organizational aspects of the system, and how do you support and evaluate the system. So as your book defines here, the process begins once you have acquired the system, and it continues through the early stages of the go live date. But you need a high level of support and sufficient staff time and resources. For those of you, and I know there's a large group that it was part of the Yale Health System, with the multiple sites and multiple campuses actually having, more than a year between go live times. And there was definitely lessons learned in those areas. I think that in terms of super users, which we're going to talk a little bit about, and having extra hands on deck to help with the charting was really helpful. But I think in some of the areas, the optimization for the end user, presenting and having, while, a lot of people were involved in the selection of products, but not customizing once the products were up and ready, not giving sufficient opportunities for the voice of the end user to be heard and have the product actually modified in a way that makes sense, is some of the complaints that I've heard. So you need to organize an implementation team and have system champions. You need people who are going to, really be the people who get this project done, who help talk it up, and get it moving. So an implementation team, if this was at a hospital, would have some of these people as part of the components. These people should do workflow and process analysis so they could actually do simulations ahead of time just to map out the workflow and make sure that things are smooth before the implementation goes live. You need the people who are actually going to install the system. Staff needs to be trained. And in multiple ways, multiple venues with ongoing support. You're going to need to talk about how past data is going to be converted. Is it going to be warehoused somewhere? Or is it going to be scanned and will be available for view only on your new system? Communications. If there is a problem, this team needs to identify ahead of time. What are we going to do? How are we going to receive complaints? Will we have a central command area where people can access peers who really understand what their problem is and can help them go through it? And the go live date. Go live should be when patient volume and census is low. So if you are a pediatric office, you probably should not have your go live for an electronic health record during RSV and flu season. You should probably do it after, shortly after kids have gone back to school. And actually, that is what my kids' pediatrician's office did. We just went the other day, and they went live on a new EHR about 3 weeks ago. And they said the timing was pretty good for them. So while you need this person who's a system champion, who's going to be well respected and is going to help lead the process, these are the characteristics of a super user. So if you are a manager or director, in charge, and some of you may have been in this position either in a leadership role or a clinical role, and you were chosen. These are people that you want to have excellent communication. Oops, I didn't mean to cross that out. I meant to circle it. Communication skills, good listening skills. They can make things happen. You want these people to see the system as being essential to progress. You want this person to be an advocate, not only for the process, but also for the staff that's using this new system. And then this person needs to assume a leadership role by gaining buy-in. They must be really positive about it. They can't be, wishy-washy, and that be clearly communicated to them. So when we're talking about the implementation process, here's some other questions you might want to ask. What are the goals of the project? What's the scope? What did this organization hope to achieve as a result? These are some of the questions we already talked about in Chapter 7. And are the risks of failing, what are the risks of failing, and what are the system goals? So those are some of the things we talked about in Chapter 7. So as part of the process, some of the key components are identifying what the major activities and the tasks are related to implementation. What are going to be some major milestones? When you can start little or great. Some of the major milestones related to each part of the project are going to be a little bit different. How long is the duration of each activity? How much interdependence is there? An example I can give you is if the inpatient area goes live, yet the outpatient clinic has maybe a year and a half or 2-year lag time, there's a lot of dependence there. When patients are seen in outpatient follow-up by the clinical specialists, and those outpatient areas don't have access to the electronic health record, or people haven't been trained to use it, it causes great challenges. You need to look at resources and budget, the roles of the members of the team, target dates, and everything that you do. And I think a lot of what we do as nurses, and we talk about evidence-based practice, but how are we going to measure success? And before you start a project, that should be one of the questions that you should always ask, whether it's a system implementation process, or it's a project on your unit, or you're leading a project in your community. How will we measure success? Most important. So you need to create an environment where you are proactive and anticipate that some things may go wrong. So as you can imagine, anything with technology, and sometimes we see that on campus with our own technology, maybe not being able to get online, or you see me once in a while fumbling around trying to get different tech presentations to work. But you have to go at it and anticipate a couple of things. You need to define the expectations. If you were the manager or the director of the clinical area, and you have to tell people, it is our expectation that we will go live with this new system by November 1st. You really have to be aware of your culture and do not underestimate the resistance. I'm sure we've all heard stories, perhaps have colleagues who, for them, transitioning to the higher powered or more integrated electronic health record pushed some people into retirement. And, for them, that might be a choice, or maybe some people left the clinical area. So it's all something to think about. You need to have enough IT support staff. And I think all of you at this point know that IT infrastructure and friends are probably some of the most valuable resources that you can have. And as our interdependence on technology grows, that's just going to become more and more apparent. There needs to be adequate initial training, yet ongoing training. If you're not using an aspect or an element of a system very often, it's going to be really important to integrate ongoing training into your regular continuing education activities. Likewise, it might be a great opportunity for you to integrate different kinds of technology. So perhaps, doing a high fidelity in situ, so on your unit simulation, using your new charting system. And you're going to have to manage those unintended consequences. There's going to be something that happens, and despite the best laid plan, you have to deal with it in the moment. I'm starring this because this is so important. You need to make sure that the system is sufficiently maintained and supported. And Calvin will talk a little bit more about this presentation. So in sum, it's really important. You need the right set of people, skills, and resources to plan for this system. Things are going to go wrong, so it's important to address the organizational aspects of this. And I think probably one of the greatest take-home messages after reading this chapter, and for those of you who've gone through a new system implementation process, this is a continuous process. Unlike perhaps 1 or 2 generations ago of computer systems or electronic health records, where you implemented it and then you used it. This needs to be a process that is continually updated, maintained, not only for best patient outcomes, but to keep up with the innovation that will actually make your team's life easier to capture, and patient encounters for both billing and documentation purposes. So I hope this presentation helps, and I'm excited for you to see the presentation by me and Calvin. Have a great afternoon.